Okay, this is going to be a tutorial on VTP or VLAN trunking protocol, and I'm going to show you how to configure and how to set up VTP and make VTP work. I'm using Packet Tracer, Cisco Packet Tracer, and this is for the Cisco CCNA. Now, VTP is a cool protocol. What it does is it allows, if you have a network with, let's say, a lot of switches in it, right? And you've set up a bunch of VLANs. Let's say you have like just a lot of switches, right? And you've set up a bunch of VLANs and you don't want to have to go from switch to switch, then configuring all those VLANs on every switch in your large network, right? And if there's a change of VLANs, if you have to add a new VLAN, instead of having to go from switch to switch to switch, adding that VLAN, what you can do is use VTP, and VTP will disseminate the VLANs and synchronize the VLANs with the other switches on the network. So it's ideal for a large network with lots of switches, and it cuts down administrative overhead by allowing those VLANs to propagate from switch to switch using the VTP protocol. Now, what we're going to do though is just try to get it to work by starting with we'll just start with two switches, right? I've got two 2960 switches, and we'll just try to make it work with two switches to start with. Now I'm going to connect them with crossover cables, port 1 to port 1, right? And there's no configurations on these switches. I just drag them out right now, right? And so we're going to make VTP work. Now we'll start by configuring it. Now we'll go into this switch and we're going to just go into it right off the bat here, switch 0, and we'll say enable, and then I'm going to do a show VTP and then a question mark, and you can see here counters password status. We'll say status, right? And so by default you can see that it says VTP version number is 2. The configuration revision number is 0, meaning that probably doesn't have any revisions, probably not activated, right? It's 0 because it's not running yet. It sees that the number of VLANs that are supported when you're running VTP is only 255, right? Now, number of existing VLANs, 5. Well, those are probably the 5 default VLANs that come enabled on the server by default. VLAN 1, the default VLAN, and then what is it? 1002, 3, 4, and 5, right? Which work with token ring and FDDI, right? So there's 5 default VLANs, so it sees 5. Now, the operating mode by default, right? This is a brand new server. We just did a show VTP command. By default, the operating mode, you can see that it's in server mode, right? So that's kind of important. Then this is important, VTP domain. You can see that there's no VTP domain set, which essentially kind of disables VTP from working, right? A couple things we need to know is how does pruning mode work? I'm going to have to talk about that eventually. Anyway, so show VTP, right? So there's nothing there, right? Now what I'm going to do is I'll do a show VLAN to show you the VLANs. Now the VLANs are, you can see 1, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. Now if we're going to share VLAN information from switch to switch, we need to make some VLANs. So I'll do a configure TE tab terminal, go to global config mode, and I'll say VLAN 11, and then I'll say VLAN 22, and VLAN 33, and VLAN 44, right? So I've just created, right? Notice I'm in global config mode, and then I'm in VLAN configuration mode, and I just made VLAN 11, 22, 33, and 44. I'll do a Control C, hit enter, and do a show VLAN, and now you can see I have these VLANs now on the switch. So now we're going to work with VTP. So we'll say conf t, which is short for configure terminal, right? And then we'll say VTP space question mark, and there it is, domain. We want to set the VTP domain name. So we'll say domain, and I'll say my domain 1, right? Or we'll just say domain 1, right? Okay, so now changing VTP domain name from null to domain 1, right? Let's do a VTP command again with a space and a question mark, and you can see the mode, configure the VTP device mode. Well, we know that it's in server by default, but let's check it out anyway. So we'll say mode and then question mark, and you can see there's the three modes: client mode, server mode, and transparent mode, right? So this is important because by default we're in server mode, and in server mode we're allowed to add, create VLANs, delete VLANs, and essentially we're going to be the one as a server to disseminate the VLANs to the clients, right? So anyway, we don't really need to do anything here, but if we did, we'd say server, right? But it says here device mode already VTP server, so we really didn't need to do anything there. Now, the other thing we're going to need to do now is we're going to need to go to the other switch, and I'll go to the other switch. This is the switch, the second switch, or switch 1, switch on the right, and I'm going to enable, and I'll do a conf T to get to global config mode, and then I'll say VTP mode, VTP, this is more important, VTP domain 1, to put it into the same domain, the same VTP domain. Then I'll say VTP mode client, so now it's in client mode. So now this has been set for client mode, and it's part of the VTP domain, and I didn't configure the VLANs on it because we want this switch to learn about the VLANs from the server. Right now, the other thing we're going to need to do is, right now, this link, right, is by default going from port 1 to port 1, and the ports on the switch are by default in VLAN 1, right, the default VLAN, right? So right now, this is what we'd call an access link, right? It's an access link right now, and we want to turn it into a trunk link so that it can trunk all the VLANs across the trunk, right? So we need to turn this link into a trunk on FA01 and FA01. So we'll go back to switch 0, and we'll, in global config mode, we'll say interface FA0/1, right? And we'll say tab switch port, and we'll say switch port mode trunk, so we'll make it a trunk, and then we'll say switch port trunk allowed VLAN 1 through 99. Okay, so now all the VLANs 1 through 99 are allowed on the trunk, and we change the mode of the port to a trunk, right? Now by default, the other FA01 port is in dynamic auto mode, so it's going to turn into a trunk. If this port is made a trunk, the other port is automatically turned into a trunk, right? And so now VLAN information should be traveling across, right? So let's see if essentially it worked. So we'll open up this switch here, right? And this is the switch that needs to learn about it. We'll go to Control C, and we'll do show VTP status, right? And you can see that the version is 2, right? Configuration revision number 0, and look, number of existing VLANs are not 5, which is default, it's 9, so it learned about 4 VLANs. It's in client mode. The domain name is domain 1, right? But it looks like it learned about the VLANs. Let's do a show VLAN command, and you'll see that it learned VLAN 11, 22, 33, and 44 from, it learned that from the other switch. So it looks like it worked. So now we have a trunk, and we have VTP enabled, and this switch is learning from this switch about the VLANs. So now let's see here. All right. So once again, show VLAN, right? 11, 22, 33, 44. So let's do this. We'll go to switch 0, and then we will do Control C, Conf T to get to global config mode, and we'll say VLAN. Let's add a VLAN. We'll add VLAN 77, right? So we just added a VLAN, right? So now do Control C. We'll do a show VTP status. You'll see that it's got a revision number of 1. It's got 10 VLANs on the switch. It's in server mode, domain 1, right? We'll go to the other switch now. Let's see if it learned about it. We'll hit our spacebar for more. Let's do a show VLAN again. There's VLAN 77, so it learned about it. And then we'll do a show VTP status, and you'll see that it's got the configuration revision number of 1 also, and so it successfully learned about the VLANs, right? So the other thing to remember is if we are to restart this switch, right, this switch does not store the VLAN information because it's in client mode, right? So as the client, it won't store VLAN information. If we restart this switch, it'll lose all its VLAN information, but it's no problem because it just needs to relearn it from the server, right? So this is the VTP server, right? And this is the VTP client.